right, welcome everybody to our experience, ASCP's podcast. I'm Chad Wers alongside my tag team partner, Tom Hansel, and I am over the moon that we have the next guest with us today, Rosemary Gibson. Um, she was a speaker for us at a keynote, I think at I want to say the 2019 meeting. She has written a number of books, but her last book was called China RX. And she was really sounding the alarms around the dependence that our country has on other countries to produce some of the advanced pharmaceutical ingredients and some of the medicines and over the counters that we take every day, and what risk that puts us under if those foreign producers are not meeting quality standards, if they're not even allowing our FDA and other groups in to inspect their facilities, and really what risk it puts on the United States and all of us when we have those situations. And was spearheading efforts to bring some of our manufacturing capacity in the pharmaceutical world back to the United States, at the very least, so that we could do it in case of an emergency. I know one of the things that we used to share from a example perspective is ciprofloxacin is one of the agents that we use to treat people that have been exposed to anthrax. But what happens if the country that's cornered the market on the production of ciprofloxacin is the one causing all of the anthrax outbreaks? They're unlikely to support us in that situation. So we've talked about things like drugs being in the strategic stockpile and being able to manufacture our own products for our own safety. So with that giant introduction, and just thrilled, Rosemary, to have you on the podcast and to have you back in front of our ASCP members. So thanks for being here.
Chad, it's really great to join you and to meet Tom. I've always appreciated your leadership and the work that your members do. Tom and I were talking before we got started about how important it is to have really skilled pharmacists to help older adults with regard to their prescription needs, and to make sure that it's done right, because there's so much hanging in the balance. So I really appreciate you and your organization and your members for what you do to help make life better and the healthcare better for older adults. It's a great gift you give to many.
Well, thank you, and I know that we share that sort of mission to make sure that we're safe with our medications. You know, pharmacists are doing that on an individual basis, whether it's how they package it or what recommendations they make to individuals on what medications might work the best for them. You know, we're always dealing in this population with drug interactions, and the fact that a number of older individuals take a number of medications, and that inherently creates some risk. But I remember back to your presentation and being struck by the fact that if I was in one of my nursing facilities looking over the meds of one of my patients, I would be trying to be a detective around a side effect that they might be having, and looking at their meds and saying, okay, what combination is causing this problem, or what medication is causing this problem? And it never would have occurred to me that the medication itself might have been manufactured under poor conditions, and it might be a medication in that situation that's causing the problem. And so you brought that to our attention and to our members' attention, and really shined a light on what risks were out there, adding to this complexity, but also, you know, creating, I think, in our members, a recognition and a desire to get it fixed and to get out of that potential risk. We want to believe in the medication that we have, that we're giving to a patient. So tell me, like, it's been, you know, I think it was 2019, you were at our meeting. What's been going on since then? What have you been doing? What progress, hopefully progress, have we made along this track of having better, safe manufacturing processes?
Yeah, sure. So it has been a while, Chad, and has been happening. I'm really delighted to have a chance to update everybody. So as you mentioned, a lot of what was predicted in China RX happened. That we had a situation beginning in early 2020 where you had the world competing for a limited supply of essential generic drugs at a time when demand was just soaring. and production capacity was certainly not increasing. It was limited by the fact that there were lockdowns. So we got into a really difficult situation where what's publicly available and through talking with people in the industry, we were weeks away from not having vital medicines. And as we saw with a lot of personal protective equipment, that the quality of what was coming in, gloves that would fall apart. There were 8 million surgical gowns that are supposed to be, clean for being used in operating rooms. They were found to have bacterial contamination, and they had to be thrown away. So we were certainly not prepared for the ramp up that we needed as a country. And I think it also showed that while we want to be interdependent, we can't make everything by ourselves. We have to do something, have manufacturing capacity here, because there were a lot of countries that said, well, yeah, we make this product, but we're not going to sell it. We're going to use it for our own people. There are countries in Europe, the UK did it, Germany did it, and of course, China did it, and India did that to some degree. So they have each country where products are made that are necessary for us, for patients here, they have a responsibility to their own population first, and then everybody else comes second. So in a lot of cases, we were second. I remember talking to a reporter in Europe, and there was a total shortage of ibuprofen. Just couldn't do it. Shortages of acetaminophen. And now I understand France has reopened one of their plants that they had closed after production moved to Asia. So we had very serious problems. And of course, we heard more about PPE than our pharmaceuticals. Perhaps they didn't want to scare the public, but we were in very deep situation. I was talking with a physician who would reorder essential medicines and was told that it was being effectively rationed. We were rationing essential medicines in the United States because of shortages. It was kept very quiet. Patients may not have known about the rationing when they would go get a prescription filled, but that's what was going on behind the scenes. I will say, on a very positive note, I may have talked earlier with you about the nonprofit organization Civica, which was set up around 2017 or 18, and they have member hospitals that chip in money. As a nonprofit, it's not capital, but they chip in money. And they asked this Civica to identify, this was pre-pandemic, to identify trustworthy manufacturers in trustworthy countries to make them products, basic medicines, including antibiotics. And so Civica signed long-term contracts with these manufacturers. Employees went and inspected these plants, had made sure there was backup capacity. This was, again, pre-pandemic. And the great thing about this, Chad and Tom, is that member hospitals who are part of Civica and were ordering these products did not have shortages of these essential medicines during the pandemic because they put a system in place to account for the fact that there'll be surge demand and there'd be a need to meet that demand. So that's a good news. And we just have to have more innovation like that, changing how big health systems use their purchasing power to change what's purchased and how it's distributed. So that's the good news.
That is good news. That
So
is great news.
Yeah.
for our listeners, I mean, you wrote your book in 2018, and pandemic hit, and you did lots of articles that you wrote since then. But give us kind of an idea of really kind of where all the medications are coming from. We talked about China a little bit, and we know that India makes a lot of the medications, but still some of that raw material you were mentioning comes from China itself. So, is there like a percentage of our dependency on one country of China?
That's a great question, Tom. Here's a way that I answer that. And it was right before the pandemic in February of 2020. And I was having dinner there were 5 people who are pharmaceutical engineers, who each of them had 30 plus experience manufacturing prescription drugs, a lot of them generic. So we were sitting around the table, and I went around and I asked them this question. So there's this virus that's approaching, and a lot of people may be hospitalized. What percentage of the core materials and raw materials that are needed to make generic drugs that are used, say, in hospital emergency rooms or critical care settings, what percentage of those are sourced from China? And we went around the table, and the answer was 90%, 95%, 90%, 90%, 95%. And these are the people that have the knowledge because they make these products or they've made them in their careers and they've had to go buy the material to produce them. The FDA doesn't have a handle on this information, but they do know, although it's not said publicly, that the US is highly dependent on a single country. The world is on a single country for these key starting materials that are used to make the active pharmaceutical ingredient, the API. A lot of people know what API is now, which is great. And those APIs then are combined with buffers and fillers, and that forms tablets. And so we have tablets, the active ingredient, and then those active ingredients are sourced from raw materials or chemicals. And those are, again, once again, located primarily in China. And just to fast forward, I was saying to Tom earlier, before we got started, an article just came out 2 days ago. And I've said all along in China RX, China RX really broke this, that we think of India as an alternative. But it turns out India depends on China for an enormous amount of the active ingredients and the products needed to make those active ingredients. And it came out during the pandemic that figure is about 69%, and that's an official government statistic. So we have all roads for the global supply of our medicines, including the branded ones, not just generic, are sourced in one country from one country. I'd say 80 to 90%. And whatever country that is, that's not a situation you really want to be in. So what came out just 2 days ago was by a bipartisan group in DC, and they looked at Aurobindo, which is a very large Indian company. I'm sure your members know it really well. They see that name on the box. And they found that they have a number of suppliers of either API or these core starting materials that are sourced from Chinese companies. And these Chinese companies are affiliated with the Chinese military. And the US government had sanctioned the parent company of four of these firms that are supplying Aurobindo and probably supplying US companies as well for the manufacture of pharmaceuticals. So we not only have such centralization, but we have centralization with actors that our own government has sanctioned. And that's a very, very troubling situation for our public health, for our national security, and frankly, for the quality and safety. Can we trust what's in those pills?
Yeah, I mean, you said yourself, whoever controls the world's health controls the world, and that's pharmaceutical. That seems like what's happening.
Yeah, think of it. Think of the leverage you have over a country, whether it's the US or any place else. And I remember when the China RX talks about the heparin incident, when there was contaminated heparin that got into the US legal supply chain, and there were a lot of people that became ill, and a number of them died. And the FDA traced it back to a plant in China. This is public information. Was Baxter Healthcare had changed from a supplier in the US to a plant in China for the active ingredient and raw materials. And there was a court case. China RX opens up with a story of Dr. Robert Allen. He walked into the Mayo Clinic in Scottsdale, Arizona, in I think it was December 2007. Long story short, he got what appeared to be contaminated heparin, and within hours, he was in multiple organ failure. And he eventually died a really horrific death from this fake substitute that had been put in as the API for this very important, ubiquitously used medicine in American hospitals. But when the FDA went to China, I was told that the government there told US government officials that they better not say bad things about China, otherwise there could be shortages. of drugs in the United States. So that leverage is very clear. If there's a outbreak of a bacterial infectious disease and we can't make antibiotics anymore, think of the leverage that another country has over us, whatever country it is. It's not a good situation.
Not at all.
So on Capitol Hill, and I know you've spent a lot of time there and talking about this subject. What's the response that you got before the pandemic, and has that changed since the pandemic? Is the awareness of our dependence now, been as you predicted, been very observed now at this point?
There has been huge awareness, which is a good thing. However, the trillions of dollars that were spent during the pandemic, these budget authorizations, none of it went to restore manufacturing of essential generic drugs. And no, we're not, and we might even be some further behind. There was a myelin plant in West Virginia, and I said this is gonna be gone, and in fact, it's gone. That production went to India and elsewhere. It's an empty facility now. All those jobs lost in the Morgantown area, and talented people, thousands of people affected by that. So this is very, very real. And in fact, some of you might remember there was an amoxicillin shortage. Was it last fall or the year before? And people couldn't get amoxicillin for their kids or for themselves or their parents. And it turns out that there's some really great people that saw that there was an old factory in Bristol, Tennessee, that was making amoxicillin finished drugs. It was owned by an Indian company. They declared bankruptcy. And so these good people here in the US, they bought the place, fixed it up. So, gee, we're going to make amoxicillin here. And they would be using API and they are using it from a trustworthy company elsewhere. And what was really stunning is that while we had this huge shortage, there were members of the public, people were just patients were calling up. They found them US antibiotics. I have no financial relationship with them. They called up US antibiotics and said, "Can I come and get my prescription filled?" They were calling the manufacturer. And of course, as you know, that's not how it works. You can't go to the manufacturer and just get your drug, and they were willing to drive miles and miles to get it. So somehow the public could find US antibiotics. But the Strategic National Stockpile folks didn't seem to be calling. The big purchasing groups didn't seem to be calling. Hospitals were not calling. And they had product to sell, and they had manufacturing capacity. So there's something else going on there, and that's concerning. So you can have manufacturing, but you need customers. You need people who are going to pay, and the price was not outrageous at all. So it's not just a pricing issue. I think there's something else that's going on there. But there is a positive news coming out that Kaiser Permanente has started testing a small number of generic drugs. And they're using that information, presumably, for their procurement decisions. And they're testing them. Do they dissolve properly? Do they have the right amount of active ingredient? Are there any contaminants in them? And now we just learned last November that the Department of Defense, they're doing the same thing. That the DoD is going to start having products tested, generic drugs tested, to ensure that they're made in the proper fashion, and that when you take that pill, that how it's supposed to be made is in fact made properly, because people are betting their lives on it. So that's good news, and hopefully we can grow that, because everything now is based on price. How cheap can we, get this? But now, given all that what's going on, we really need to bring quality into the conversation and into purchasing decisions. And now hospitals and everybody else were flying blind. So I think it's a great step forward. A lot of folks don't like it, but I think it's the right thing to do in the marketplace, to have quality information about these things that are so important that, again, people bet their lives on.
Yeah, I actually used a pharmacy that was called Valisure, and it kind of changed names, but I think they they were one of the people that came up with technology to test products. And it seems like they've moved away from, testing batches and filling prescriptions to testing batches for companies to be able to guarantee that it was made the way it was supposed to make, like you're describing with Kaiser um, Permanente.
That's right.
But
And my
that's not
understand, yeah, and my understanding is that Kaiser is using Valisure, and
okay.
the DoD is using Valisure, and
Yeah.
they're an ISO accredited laboratory, so they don't do GMP testing, but they are testing for, is it dissolving properly? Is it the correct amount of API? And they're the ones that found that ranitidine or Zantac, that patients who would take it, that would have just the stability of the molecule was such that could have carcinogenic impact on patients. And there was a lot of naysayers about that. Oh, that's bad science. But it turns out there were court cases, and the manufacturer, GSK, back then GlaxoSmithKline, during court proceedings, produced a paper from their own people 40 years early, 42 years ago, saying that they knew that the product could form carcinogens. They knew it. And only then did the FDA say, we've got to take this off. Meanwhile, other countries had already taken that step forward. So it's a challenging terrain to get into because the industry is not used to having other people test their products. But it's opening up a lot of eyes now that we need to take a closer look at the quality of our drugs and not just buy everything strictly on price. Because what's really happened is that I just think what the FDA is charged to do is so big and so huge. They have 1,000 manufacturing plants that are supposed to be inspected, and there's a huge backlog, and that comes from the Government Accountability Office. It's an impossible task. So I'm supportive of doing something, and let's start with having the private sector come in and complement what it is that FDA does. Because it's just too big for one government entity to do it.
And to be fair, what Valisure is done is create a fence line. So at least for the products that they're testing and the batches that they're verifying, there's some accountability that what says on the bottle is in the bottle. But if they determine that a country is either purposely or accidentally delivering poor products, there's still no ability.
Right.
You're basically just saying, oh, just like with ranitidine, it's bad. We can't take it anymore. But what if it's a drug that we can't switch to an alternative? That the only other option is to make it. We're still not on that side of the fence with an ability to make it if we need to make it,
That
or invest in making it.
that's a great point. And we talked about Cipro earlier, Chad. You mentioned that. And the reality is we can't make Cipro here, or we could, but we're not. And what's happened here is that China's dumping the raw material on the global market at below market prices.
Right.
And what does that mean? That means if the three of us, Chad, Tom, and me, we wanted to start a company making Cipro, it'd be really hard to do that because we couldn't compete with companies that are selling it at way below market price. And that's the strategy. That is the absolute strategy to undercut U.S. and other Western manufacturers. So we are driven out of business, or we don't even think of going into that business. And I showed that in China RX. I think, Chad, I showed it back in 2019 when I was with everybody in Texas. This is the strategy. And the data came from European industry showing with penicillin how they dumped penicillin raw material on the global market and kept it low for 4 years. And that's exactly when the last U.S. penicillin fermentation plant shut down up in Syracuse, New York. So that is a deliberate strategy. So this is not just about, well, it's cheaper over there from there, either India or China, because it's fewer regulations, lower labor costs. No. There's a plan to disable our ability and the ability of other countries to make our own medicines. and that's just a
Even,
fact.
even if we opened up a bunch of manufacturing plants, do we have the ability to get the raw material from outside of China? Even if we decided as a government
For
to
a lot
kind
of
of,
places, that's why I asked that question at our roundtable at dinner in February 2020 with pharmaceutical manufacturing experts. And the answer is no. And so that's why we need to begin to really concentrate on that and make investment in it. And it's doable if we want to. At the same time, we also need customers. So if we set up a company, we would need the raw materials, yes. We would also need the customers to buy it.
Which, I mean, it sounds like campaigns, buy American, buy USA. To your point, we don't think of medicine that way. We don't necessarily look at over the counter products and see that it's made in the USA and choose to buy that. But that needs to be a campaign. You would think the government would invest in themselves or invest in this country as opposed to not doing it. I'm shocked by the amoxicillin plant where they couldn't find customers, but it will be arguably more expensive. Um, and maybe it's not even a lot more expensive, but still, that seems to be this race to the bottom mentality that we're in. But what I wanted to bring up was I think finally there's some opportunity for the public to get an understanding of this. And interestingly enough, I felt like during the Super Bowl, there were multiple commercials for Temu, which is this Chinese based, I don't know, Amazon like company. And my experience with Temu is just seeing the ads on different platforms and being struck by how inexpensive the things were that they were, attempting to sell. And the knee jerk reaction somebody like me has, being is 50 years old, is, my dad always told me if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. I'm looking at those products and there's no way you can buy that for $40. Um, and I think the general public, for the most part, can see that. They can see that that's a problem. And I think if we can relate that to, well, this isn't just happening with widgets and things that you can buy on Amazon. This is what happens with drugs. This is what happens with over the counter vitamins. This has been going on for a while. And we have to make a concerted effort to move away from that model.
I
Um,
think that's absolutely right. And even on Amazon now, I read
yeah,
a figure that what 40-50% of what's sold on Amazon is sourced from China. And what they do, and I've met US companies where you'll have firms over there that will come up with a fake website selling the exact same looking product at a cheaper price. And the US company just cannot compete, and
right.
their business has dramatically declined or they're put out of business. Again, I've actually talked to manufacturers and they would show me the websites where their invention, their product, we're not talking about medicines here, they were for sale.
Yeah.
And
There, there's a
how they were
there's a
knocked
story
out of
about
the game.
there's a story of an Etsy user that said her entire portfolio on Etsy, you're making handcrafted things, you're making, local products, was hijacked by a Chinese company, stole the pictures, everything, and were selling it below what she could sell it for. So it's not even just giant things that you might think about. They're attacking, you know, our supply chain everywhere.
Well, it's kind of a heavy statement to make, but and China RX makes it. It's economic warfare.
Right.
It's economic warfare. And what I'm concerned about is Amazon and other folks. You can get your prescription medicines by mail, and I predict that what's going to happen is that it's just a matter of time before those generic medicines will be coming directly from China
Yeah.
into the mailboxes of Americans. And I say this because look what's happening with FDA inspections in China. I was very impressed, but certainly not a good direction, that the FDA Commissioner Califf last March of 2023, testified before Congress. This is on the FDA budget for 2024. And he said that